Welcome back. Today, we're going to put together everything we've learned in Python so far by building an exciting text-based adventure game. You'll play as a knight, embarking on a dangerous quest, and we'll use all the programming concepts you've mastered: variables, loops, data types, functions, and more. Ready to start this adventure? Let's go! Before we begin our knight's journey, let's set the stage. Every great adventure starts with a story, and our game is no different. Let's print a message that will introduce the player to the world of the game, the Kingdom of Eldoria. We are going to use a lot of text and data types in this tutorial, so I'm going to leave a copy of the code in the description so that you can copy texts in prints and other things. With this introduction, we've given the player some context. They know now they're entering a world where their actions will shape the fate of the kingdom. This creates a sense of immersion before they even begin playing. Now that we have the story in place, let's move on to setting up our knight's stats. Alright, let's begin by creating the stats for our brave knight. These stats will define our character in the game. We'll be working with different types of data, integers, strings, and lists, to make sure our knight is fully equipped for the adventures ahead. First, we'll set the knight's health, which will be stored as an integer. We've just given our knight a starting health of 100. Next, let's track how much gold our knight is carrying. Gold will also be stored as an integer, since it's a numerical value. So now, we've got health and gold, but every knight needs a weapon. Let's give our knight a weapon, which we'll store as a string. For now, let's start with the sword. Finally, let's give our knight an inventory. We'll use a list to store the items they pick up along their journey. The inventory starts off empty, but we'll be adding items as the adventure continues. Now that we have our knight's basic stats, health, gold, weapon, and inventory, let's make the game more interactive by asking the player for their knight's name. We'll use the input function to gather this information. As you can see, using the input function lets us engage the player by asking for their knight's name. This makes the game feel more personal and interactive. Now we have a fully defined character with stats, and the player is ready to dive into the adventure. Now that we've set up our knights with basic stats, it's time to let the player make choices. To do this, we'll create a basic game loop using while true. This loop will keep running until the player chooses to quit, offering options to explore, rest, check their stats, or exit the game. Let's go through the setup step by step. We start with the while true loop. This is an infinite loop that will keep presenting the player with choices until they decide to quit the game. We use print to display a menu with 4 options: exploring, resting, checking stats, or quitting. Next, we ask the player to make a decision using input. This captures the player choice as a string, and we'll use that input to determine what happens next. If the player chooses to explore by entering 1, we simulate an adventure where the knight loses a bit of health because, let's face it, adventuring is dangerous. We subtract 10 from their health and give feedback using print to let them know what happened. If the player chooses to rest by entering 2, they regain some health. Here we add 20 to the health variable, letting the player know they're feeling refreshed after their rest. Option 3 allows the player to check their current stats. We print out the knight's health, gold, weapon, and the contents of their inventory. This gives the player a snapshot of how they're doing in the game. Finally, if the player chooses 4, they quit the game. Here, the break statement is key. It exits the while true loop, ending the game. We say farewell to our brave knight and close the loop. If the player enters an invalid option, anything that isn't 1, 2, 3, or 4, we handle it with an else statement that tells them to try again. This basic game loop lets the player interact with the world by making choices that affect their health and stats. As we build the game, we'll expand these options to include more adventures, items, and challenges. What's an adventure without some excitement? Let's introduce random encounters to make our game more engaging. Using Python built-in random module, we can simulate different events, such as encountering an enemy or finding treasure. With if-else statements, we can give the player choices and communicate the consequences of those choices, depending on the decision they make. The knight's health or gold will change. We've added the random module to our game to randomly select from 3 possible outcomes when the player explores. For example, encountering an enemy, finding treasure, or nothing happens. When the player encounters an enemy, we'll explain what's at stake. We'll tell them that fighting could result in either a reward, 20 gold for victory, or a consequence, losing 15 health if defeated. On the other hand, fleeing will guarantee safety from combat, but it comes at the cost of losing 25 gold. This way, the player understands the risks and rewards of their decision before making a choice. This way, the player can make an informed decision, knowing exactly what might happen if they choose to fight or flee. In contrast, discovering gold is always a lucky event. The knight will find a chest filled with 50 gold, which gets added to their inventory, no combat involved. Sometimes, not every adventure leads to a reward or danger. If the random event is nothing, the player will receive a message telling them their journey was uneventful, which maintains the pacing and suspense of exploration. With these random encounters and choices, we've added another layer of complexity to the game. Players now have to make strategic decisions, knowing the consequences. Fighting might cost health, but fleeing will cost gold. This creates a dynamic gameplay experience where every choice matters. That's all for today. Join me next time as we add more depth and challenges to our adventure. Happy coding, and I'll see you in the next dimension.